Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll start the Chulin daf Nun Beis. We are going to begin on Nun Beis Amud Aleph, about 4 lines before the lines get wide, which is a good 12 lines from the top. Nishtibru Soloyos. So, Roiv Soloyos, rather, that if you have the majority of the ribs of the animal that are broken, that will render it as a treifa. Now we're going to see that there are 11 ribs on each side, so you have to have the majority of all of them broken. We'll see exactly how that breaks down. Now, in this book, interestingly, it says, the Rashi explains, again, there are 11 ribs on each side, and thus the Gemara considers 6 broken ribs on each side to be the majority. Not just 6, but rather 6 on each side, as we'll see in a moment. Now, it's quoted by the Kaf Chaim. The Zivchei Tzedek explains that although we find 13 ribs on each side of the animal, and actually there's a picture over here that says the 13th rib, only 11 are considered ribs for treifa purposes. So interestingly enough, there are actually 13 technically, but when we're talking about these dinim, we considered 11. Excluded are the most cranial ribs, one on each side, for they are included in the chazah, the chest, one of the portions given to the kohen, and are not considered ribs for this purpose. Likewise, the most caudal of ribs on each side is excluded, for they are small ribs that don't contain much marrow and do not fit the definition of ribs set down by Rabbi Yochanan, which the Gemara is going to say later on, who reports that the 13th rib does contain some liquid marrow, but it is not hardened and therefore does not qualify. So, in summation, of the 13 ribs on each side, we consider only 11 to be salois, real halachic ribs in this case. The 13th rib is eliminated because it does not have physical characteristics of ribs, and the first because it's halachically considered a different part of the animal, the chazah, the chest. So, an interesting detail for those that are saying, what are you talking about? It's not 11 ribs, it's 13. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction. So, Tanu Rabbanan. Eilhein roiv tzlois. This would be enough for it to constitute as a majority. Sheish mikan v'sheish mikan. So, obviously, the majority of 11 is 6 on each side. Not 6, but 6 and 6. Or o achas esrei mikan. If all 11 are broken on one side, v'achas mikan, and 1 on the other side. So it'll be, in other words, you need to have 12, but it doesn't have to be the majority of both sides. Even if they're all broken on one side, as long as they're equals the 12 by having 1 extra rib broken on the other side, that will render it a treifa, according to this opinion. Or mezi'iri u'machatzin klapi shedra. He says that it has to be that it's referring to the upper half near the spine for it to be rendered a treifa. It would not be an issue if it was broken closer downward by the breast. That's what Rashi says. These 12 ribs have to be klapi shedra, lefi shesham chayusa, because that's where its life is more intact, more necessary for survival. But if it's below, it could survive even with many broken ribs. Okay. Omer Rabba Barbar Chana Omer Rabbi Yochanan of Tzlois Gedolos. When we're dealing with large ribs, Sheish Behen Mayach, they have to have marrow. So this is again the reason why one of the ribs, even though again there's 13, but one of them really should count, but because it doesn't have the adequate amount of marrow, so therefore, or it's not, doesn't have marrow, or as we said over here again, that it may have marrow, but it doesn't have the physical characteristics because it does contain some liquid marrow, but it's not hardened. So for that reason, that would not count as a rib. That's the reason why this is being brought down. Amar Ula ben Zaki Amar Nekru, let's say, not that it broke, but let's say the ribs were pulled apart. In other words, there was a dislocation of the ribs. So what's the din when it comes to that? Barov tzad echad, if the majority of one side there's a dislocation. So obviously, as Rashi points out, even if there's 6 on the one side that are dislocated, that'll make it a treifa. But again, when it comes to breaking, it has to be 12. That's the distinction. So interestingly, a broken rib is not as significant as a dislocated rib, because a dislocated could puncture other organs, presumably. If it's broken, hopefully it'll heal. If it's just 1 or 2 ribs, ribs can heal a broken rib. But dislocated is a lot worse. Okay, that's baroiv tzad echad nishbru baroiv shnei tzadim. If it's broken, as we said, the majority on both sides, then as we said, that's the distinction. Rabbi Yochanan Aimer bein ne'ekru bein nishtabru baroiv shnei tzadim. Actually, Rabbi Yochanan is makel here, and he says that it's not just when it comes to broken ribs, but also when it comes to dislocated ribs, it has to be roiv shnei tzadim. It has to be the same din, 12. So not just rov on one side, but it has to be rov on both sides. Amarav nekrat sela. Let's say we have again a rib which is dislocated, v'chulia, and also its vertebrae together with it, ima. So treifa. So in that situation, it's a treifa. It's not just that you have a rib that's dislocated, but also the vertebrae of the backbone. So that is a lot worse, and therefore that in itself will render a treifa. Amrullah, Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav nekrat sel makan, but sel makan. Let's say you have a rib which was dislocated on this side and the other side. V'chuya kayemes. However, its vertebrae which connects the two still is intact. Mahu. So Amrullahu gistra. He says that that's considered to be like an animal that's a gistra, which we said is like an animal that's split. So gistra kamrisa. And as Rashi says, bitmiya behema shenisika b'yamsisa. If you have an animal that's split in the middle, we know that's a nevela. Okay. V'ha rav nami gistra kaimer. So ki kamar rav selabul chulia. He's talking about a situation of the rib and not the vertebrae. Okay. But he was talking about the rib and the vertebrae. What do you mean not the vertebrae? He said beferish and the vertebrae. So he means sel v'chatzi chulia. Maybe it was only the rib and part of the vertebrae. But if certainly otherwise it would be a gistra. Must be they're also saying that if it's a rib without the vertebrae, the army law gistra kamrisu, and they still will say that it's a gistra. Look at Rashi. V'chatzi chulia v'atzela shekenegdo mechuberes yafa. The ribs which are connected to half of the vertebrae is connected well, and that half is kayemas. Okay. So V'yomer Ula ben Zakai Amar Neker Baroiv Tzad Echad. If let's say it was dislocated, the majority of the ribs on one side, or Nishtbru Baroiv Shnei Tzadim, or that it's broken on both sides. So Amulcha Hasam Zeh Shelo Keneged Zeh. Over there is because the ribs are not opposite one another. In other words, we're saying even if all you had is one rib, that's a problem. That's because they're Zeh Keneged Zeh. So hacha zeh keneged zeh. To make it into a nevela, the problem is when this rib and this rib, there's problems with it. But when the ribs are not, the right rib and the left rib are not all connected, in other words, there may be a problem on this rib but not on that rib, then it's less of an issue. He says that you need to have the majority of both sides and the majority. So I understand. So this is the problem. If we're saying, let's say there's 12 ribs that were broken, for example. So that means, obviously, if the majority are problematic, there has to be at least one set of ribs on both sides that are both problematic. You can't say zeh shelo keneged zeh if you also require rov, because if you require rov, then the majority, because there's a majority, at least one of them is going to be zeh keneged zeh. So how do you answer that? Your answer is Hasam Buchna below Asisa. Over there is a pestle without mortar. Hacha Buchna v'Asisa. This is the Buchna and the Asisa, the pestle and the mortar, which means this is what makes it into a gistra. Says Rashi, Kloimer Selaviksas Chulia. Once you have an issue with a rib and part of the vertebra, Rav Yochanan Sela B'loi Chulia. Okay, so Yihachi Hainu Rav, Lushmilu the Rav. Even though Rav Kahana Rav Asi we're saying is talking about a rib and part of the vertebrae, that's really the same thing that Rav said. Okay, fine, but that's not. He didn't. They didn't hear this from him before. So v'liboy minei Rav Savri v'liboy minei Chada the Parishlan Tartilo Bi'inon minei. He said one was explained and two I did not need from them. Says Rashi, what is that? So Hanich the Ibi'inan minei Chada Hanicha I Amerlon Treifa Koshkein Tarti. I Amerlon Ksheira Kati Tarti Kamaboilon. So if you said only one, that the first one's kosher, the question is the status of two. So Yehachi Hashinami the Kaboy Mine Tarti. Now that he's saying that there's a question about two, Hanicha I Amerlahu Ksheira Koshkein Chada. The I Amerlahu Treifa, two is Treifa, Akati Chatim Boilhu. So you could still ask it could still be a question on the other side. If you don't know the status, if you know the status of two is treifa, but that doesn't mean necessarily one is kosher, right? Maybe you still have to ask the question. So Sarvi Imkin Mirsach Harosach. He didn't want to basically go back and forth and perhaps agitate. Chada treifa tartim boy. So he in fact found out that one alone is a treifa, and therefore two, it stands logically that it is a treifa. Abaha ka'amrile v'lo rasach kivan de karmelhu gister kamrisu hainu rische. Once he said it's a gistra, so he did express his emotions. Okay. All right, let's take a peek at question 12 over here. Nishbaru o nekru rov soloseha. Let's say the majority of the ribs are either dislocated or broken. Kama slois ham roiblios treifa. How much is it render it as a treifa? So, when it comes to broken, as we said before, it's the majority of both sides, which is 12 ribs, either 6 and 6 or 11 and 1. Okay, nekru. If it got dislocated, it's a machlokas. If it's the majority of one side, which is just 6 ribs, or do you need also there both sides, therefore being 12 ribs? And that we saw was the machlokas over there. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's look at question TA20. Nishbar rov soloseha broshne stadim treifa be'eza mokum b'salois nishbar be'elu salois ayri. So we said, according to Z'iri, it's Maksin Klapi Shedra. It's the upper half near the spine. And it was Salois Gadol Sheish Behen Moyach. And also, it has to be that the ribs which have marrow, which would exclude, as we said, that 12th rib. Okay. Is there any more for that? No. TB 23 Nishma Rov Soloseha Be'eza Malkam Nishma Eza Slois Iri. So it's the same question. 12 ribs B'shtei Stadim. Right. Uva Slois Sheish Moyach Alehem. That's true. But also I was missing that it has to be Klapi Shedra. I missed that, unfortunately. Klapi Shedra, right? By the top of the ribs. Okay. So that's TB 23. TB 23. Okay. All right. So that's the more, and they stay away from all these other this other shakvatari over here. Okay. Amar Rabba bar Shilo Amar Rav Masna Amar Shmuel Nekrat Selami Kara. Let's say that the rib gets completely dismantled from its place. It says Rashi Afilu below a sisa, right? Which is even without its mortar, it's like it's completely gone. If Golgoiles Shenech Besa Baruba, let's say you have a skull, we're going to dive into this a little bit more in Amud Beis, that kept getting banged by the majority. You have the flesh that covers the majority of the stomach. If that itself is damaged, then treifa. So we analyze each of these cases. Nekroselami kara treifa. So first of all, if there's an issue with a rib that it is completely dismantled, it's treifa. Minhu. So for the Gemara, what are you talking about? We already learned kalma chisaron b'shedra. So there's this famous machlokes we saw in numerous places already. Machlokes b'yisham b'yisrael. B'yisham amrim shtei chuliyos. If there's two missing vertebrae, b'yisrael amrim chuliyachas, one missing vertebrae. B'yam Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul v'chein lo treifa. So this actually has to do with the dinim of tumas oil. Rashi doesn't really get too much into this. It just says v'lo tatami b'oil below basar. So in order to be matame b'oil, you need robinyan, the shedra golgoilus. So if you have the skull, if you have the spinal column, but it's missing vertebrae, is it considered to be still matame b'oil? So according to what happens, it's only missing one vertebrae. So Beis Hillel says one is enough to being missing that it's no longer considered to be matam b'oil. So therefore, it's like a kula. On the other hand, if Beis Hillel holds that when it comes in treifa, if you're missing one vertebrae, then it's already a treifa. So therefore, he's l'chumra. That's why Beis Hillel, you can't just pick and choose whoever you want, because it's like walking in the dark, as we said before. So hacha tzel b'loi chulia. So over here, we're talking about a rib without its vertebrae. Hasam chulia b'lo tzela. Over there, we're talking about the issue of a vertebrae without the rib. Look at Rashi. The Beis Hillel mitrafa b'chad chulia. Even if it's missing one vertebrae. Al mul shmua kiris chulia hu tarfa. Removing the vertebrae makes a treifa. V'lo kirisella, so it's really a kasha. We see the whole issue is a missing vertebrae, not a completely dislocated missing rib. So he says like this: Bishlam etzel b'lo chulia. I can understand an issue with a rib without the vertebrae, mishkachasla. That could happen. How could it be they have a vertebrae without the rib? So bishli kafli. So Rashi says yesh chuliyos harbe shinsham slois, which is look. There's a lot of vertebrae which don't have ribs attached to it. Okay. Maskevil Ravoisha. So v'lisnei gabi kuli beisham yochomer Beis Hillel. Why don't we mention this as an exception? Beis Shammai is usually strict, but here we see when it comes to din treifa that Beis Hillel is strict. So Amalei Rav ki itchil inyan tuma itchil, because it's really this whole thing was brought down legabi, not treifa. It's just a sidebar, so too by treifas. But really, the whole point of Machlos Beis Shammai's Hill regarding one vertebrae is really about the dinim of tumas oil, and in that Beis Hillel is indeed l'kula. Okay, now let's. That was just a little sidebar over here. So, what does it mean b'shili kalfi, which means at the end of the flanks? This refers to the 6 lumbar vertebrae that span from the thoracic vertebrae above the ribs to the sacrum. These vertebrae have no ribs attached to them. Okay. They could also be called solos katanos, small ribs, because there are horizontal projections of bone resembling wings. Anyway, that's what is at the end of the flanks, which is referring to these vertebrae which have no ribs. So it's possible you could have a vertebrae without ribs. So let's just get the language right at the end of the flanks. Okay, so that's At the end of the flanks. Okay. All right. Okay, let's keep on moving. Then we have almost the end of the Mishnah over here. But before we get to that, we're going to understand these other two cases. The Golgoyles, if you have a skull, nichbisa baruba, that it received many blows, then it becomes a treifa. So by Rabbi Yirmiyah, roiv goiva or roiv hakifa teku, the majority of its height or of its circumference teku. Okay, so it says Rashi min hey naim lamala, from the eyes above, rov hakifa gadol merav gova, the majority of the circumference is more than its height. Okay, so we don't know. Teku. Ubasar chayfer roiv hakeres, if let's say it's missing flesh that covers the majority of the keres of the stomach, baruba, the majority of it's missing, that's a problem. So it becomes a treifa. So boy Rav Ashi, boroiv karoa or borov notul, says Rashi, is it the majority of its tear, and certainly the majority of its removed? Says Rashi, or barov nitol. Shenitol ruba, the majority is taken out, or barov karua lo mitrafa, if it's just torn. So the question is it gone or is it torn? So tishli miditanan. Keres apanimus, which again we had trouble exactly identifying where the keres apanimus was. Therefore we go l'chomer, as we saw in the Gemara a few days ago. So you have this inner keres shenikva that has a hole, o shenikra, or it's torn, which is whole or torn. Roiv hachitzayin, the majority of the outer parts are treifa. Which is what we hold like. We hold like b'nei marav in this case, that we say the entire inner stomach, the entire keres is considered keres panimi, that even a hole is a problem. Vezu keres hachitzayna. What's the outer is basar chayfes roiv hakeres. It's just the flesh that covers the majority of the stomach. So midihu taima el shmuel. Hachiyamar Rabbi Yankov bar Nachman amar Shmuel makam she'ein bo milus. It's the place in which there is no hairs. Okay. All right. V'drusas azev. So when it comes to the azev, its claws inject poison into an animal and it burns its insides. So let's learn about the clawing of a wolf. It's going to be almost a half a page over here. Just bear with me. The discussion of the Gemara requires explanation for its implicit suggestion, made explicit by Rashi, that the claws of preying animals inject venom into their victims. Right? So that's a question. So we know today that these animals do not produce venom. It's difficult to assume that the animals of that era possess the complex capabilities necessary of chemically manufacturing poison, subsequently lost it. Okay? We must then conclude that it is not venom that makes the wolf's claws fatal. Indeed, the Rambam makes no reference of venom or poison in its codification of its laws. So how do we understand it becoming treifa? So Aryeh Carmel explained that the lethal component of the clawing process is most likely what is known as cat scratch poison, a collection of infectious bacteria that is often present in the claws of preying animals. So it's not really venom as we know, like from a snake's venom, but it's the fact that they have bacteria on them. These animals have claws that retract into small chambers in the foot when not in use. Bits of decaying meat often collect in these chambers, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. When it attacks, the animal extracts its claws together with some of its infectious materials. The wounds produced by the clawing are thus immediately infected with potentially fatal results. Okay. It should be noted, however, that the wolf, a member of the dog family, has claws that do not retract. Okay. This explanation facilitates the understanding of many of the halakhic details the Gemara sets forth regarding the attacked animal. For example, unlike venomous reptiles that kill with their bite, here we're concerned not with a bite, but with its clawing. Additionally, the Gemara's requirement that the predator attack purposely and with vigor can be understood in terms of the necessity for the predator to extract its normally hidden paws and to dig them into a victim in a manner that effectively transfers the infectious material upon extraction from the victim. So sometimes it may just attack with its paws, but when it recognizes that they're in danger, they need to attack, then they'll let their claws out, and then by doing that, that's where the bacteria and the infections can take place. Finally, the explanation is further enforced by the requirement that the clawing take place proximate to a life-sustaining organ. This indicates that the poison is not systemic in nature, as is the chemical venom of snakes, which may enter the bloodstream at any point with fatal results. Okay, it's interesting to note that an animal bitten by a poisonous snake is not a treifa. This is because physical damage to a specific organ is necessary to affect the treifa status, while a systemic injury merely renders the animal as a goises, not a treifa. Okay. Fine. So it's so interesting. With Carmel, and who's a mentor of Eliezer Dessler, Eliyahu Dessler says that even though it's true that maybe there's certain things that may not necessarily apply so much in the time of the Gemara to nowadays, the laws are still binding. This is because it is not the explanation supplied by the sages that created the laws. Rather, the laws in their pure form were transmitted like Halachah Moshe Sinai. So therefore, we can't say, well, it doesn't apply to us anymore. So we're going to again be discussing these things now. So very fascinating piece, which is Kedai to you to understand this, that a zav doesn't really have poison, right? It's an infectious bacteria on their claws. Okay, so Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Bebehema min hazav. We're talking about an animal from a wolf. Lamala of oifos min hanetz lamala, from a hawk and above. Humuti mai ilem limuti chatul. So look at Rashi. Min hanetz lamala yesh boi koyach lidrois oif chavero. So it has the ability to also damage its counterpart, right? But only animals that are that big and strong, as opposed to those that are smaller. Luti chatul is coming to exclude a cat that doesn't have the capacity to make something into a treifa with its claws. Tenina v'drusa sazev. So we said with regard to the claws of the wolf, the chite mohakamash mulan dezev begasa nami doris. Maybe it's coming to tell you that a wolf also has the capacity to be able to attack even a large animal. It's not true, because we know a zav, it could attack a small animal, but it can't destroy a huge animal. It doesn't have the capacity. But an ari can destroy a large animal. Says Rashi. You think maybe a snake could do this, a cat could do this. Maybe if the chiddush is when it comes to a cat, so it could damage a small animal. However, it can render a small animal treifa. However, zav could even make a large animal treifa. It's not true, because we see clearly that it says that drusa says zav can only harm a dak and not a gasa. Maybe they just argue on this mitzias. The Yom Rabbi Yemen Bar Yefes, Rabbi Yilah, Lo Rabbi Huda El Lafarish Dever Chachamim. He's just coming to explain the words of Chacham. So the answer is Gaber Karamas, says Rashi. The Rabbi Eliezer Adarav. The Rav Savar, the Rabbi Huda Poli, V'tanakama Afilo Begasa Kaimer. The Yisrach the Rav Ashmi'inan, the Ben Hazev, Lomata, Fil Bedaka Nami Lo, when it comes to a zav and down, even a daka not. Delo tema haidek tani zav mishum gasa avol daka afil chatul nami. Right? Okay. V'imoy seimo lo'oil miyimuti chatul. Maybe this comes to exclude a cat. Madatema or chadamilsa katani kamashmuan. And maybe it's just coming to tell you, why is it mentioned a wolf? Because that has more, it's more normal that it does damage with its claws than a cat. Kamashmuan. Okay. So maybe it's a chatul also is daitis. Oimer Rav Amr Rav Chista. Drusas chatul v'nemya. Let's say we have the clawing of a cat and a marten. So begadim v'taloyim, if it attacks these small goats and sheep, derusas, then it could do damage. Derusas chulda b'oifais, and a weasel has the capacity to do damage to birds. So meisvei derusas chatul, when it comes to the derusa of a cat, nates a hawk, the nimya and a marten, ad shetinaki v'chalal, until it makes a hole inside the animal of a derusa leselhu, but it's clawing, or with its bacteria filled or poisonous claws, it does not do. So what are you talking about? How could you be telling me that a chatul has the capacity in a nimya to be able to even with its claws to make a gedi or taleh into a treifa? It's not true. We see it's not the case. Dizra nates lodaris. So, but in that category, it also mentions a hawk. So you tell me a hawk doesn't do that? V'tanan v'dusas and nates. It says clearly that a nates, a bird, a hawk does have the capacity to do massive damage with its claws. So obviously that's not how we read this piece above. Lokasha. So it's a distinction. When it comes to innates, it has the capacity to be able to immediately with its claws do damage with birds. However, when it comes to Gedima Taloyim, it's only until there's a hole there. Mikol Makom or Rav Chista Kasha. But nonetheless, according to Rav Chista, it's a kasha. So who the Yamaki Haitan, the Sanyu Baribi Oimer Lomeru, Ein Derisa, Ein Derusa Elba Makom Shein Matzilin. We only say the concept of Ein Dursa that doesn't have the capacity to by a chatul, by a snake, I keep saying that, by a cat to not do damage is only she'in matzilin, if no one is trying to save it. Of a makom sheish matzilin yesh drusa. However, if someone is trying to save it, then it will attack. As we said, sometimes it will not use all of its abilities, but in certain times it will. Says Rashi, if there's no one around to try to save the bird, so it kind of knows it doesn't have to use all of its strength. However, in a place where people are trying to save its prey, says Rashi, who kayis, the cat gets angry, ve'shel eches chazak, and therefore it's going to use its strength, literally it's stronger poison. Ukshemaka b'tzipayin, when it hits with its nails or claws, mashech ba'eres, it's going to take out. I'm just going to keep translating eres as bacteria. That's because that's how we just learned it. So in the state sheish matzilin, so that's when we'll say that a cat taka does have the capacity to make something to a treifa, right? So if there's someone trying to save it, so then basically that means it's gets angry because it doesn't want anyone around to save it, to save this bird, and therefore that's when it will kill it basically. Okay, v'makam shei matzilin. So you're telling me when there's no one around in Drusa, cat doesn't use its claws to inject its bacteria. He tarnagaylis. There was this bird, the Havoy be Rav Kahana, the Rohit Chatul Batre. There was a cat that was chasing this bird. Vial Dorna, and also regarding a hen, the it chid the seb desha ba'apeh. So it basically, the threshing floor got closed up in front of it. Umichia ladesha b'sichufuya, and basically the cat stuck its claws into this door. And they found that there was 5 drips of poison of like in its blood. Right? Basically, it's saying that we see that this chatul was chasing these birds, and there was no one really to save it. So it wouldn't really have had this higher level of clawing, but we see that it still did. So we should not make that distinction, because there was no hatzala in that case. The answer is that's not true, because hatzalas atzma nami katzalas acherem dami. The fact that it was trying to save itself and running away, that in itself is what incites the incite of the cat. So it's not just someone else is trying to save the bird, then all of a sudden gets angry. If you are trying, the bird recognizes its life is in danger and starts running away, that will also get the cat onto this next level. Rabbanan zihara islay, the cat has this bacteria, v'lo zihira, but it doesn't necessarily burn its victims to the highest level. It doesn't have the capacity, it says Rashi, enu sayrif, which again, when a person has a massive infection, you feel burning. So that's what it's referring to, perhaps. What do you mean? If there's no one chasing it, trying to save it, that there's no derusa, Hutana goes the Havoy Beirav Kahana, the Rahel Chatul Batrag, and you have the cat running after it, Val Doruna, and also a hen. Vis Choladesha Bape, and basically it went and hid itself by the threshing area. Umichladesha Betsichufia, and this cat stuck its claws into that door. Kurti dama. Same question. Right? So hatzosa atzma nami katzosa cherem damya. Bomine Rav Kahana Merav Nun Gimel Madalf. Yesh derusa lechatul o ein derusa chatul, which is basically what we've been discussing up until now. How Rashi says, okay, that's it. So Amalei af lechulda yesh drusa. Even a chulda, which is like a weasel, which is smaller, there is drusa, and then certainly it has the capacity to do damage with its claws. There's certainly a cat. So yesh drusa lechulda o ein drusa lechulda. And then almost then he asks the question, how about the weasel? So Amalei af lechatul ein drusa. Also, when it comes to the weasel, also a cat does not have derusa. If a cat doesn't have derusa, then the smaller one certainly should not. V'chatul v'chulda yesh lehem derusa o ein lehem derusa. If it's a chatul and a chulda, is there a derusa or not? So Malay chatul yesh derusa, chulda ein derusa, v'lo kasha. So this is very confusing, because on one hand we're saying that a snake, I keep saying snake, a cat is, because I keep thinking of venom, that a cat has derusa. In other places it doesn't. It says it doesn't. Same thing when it comes to a weasel and a chulda. So which one is it? So hadiyar malay afal chulda. When you said, he said also the weasel yesh derusa can destroy ba'ofos. That means it can make an oaf into a treifa because it's small. Hadiyar malay afal chatul and derusa. When we said that a cat cannot kill, is be'imri ravravi, if we're talking about large sheep, because it's too big to be able to do damage. So those are the 3 levels. So even a chulda can do damage for a bird. However, a cat cannot do damage to a large sheep. However, when it comes to gedim and taloyim, these small livestock, there it depends. A cat, there is derusa, however, not a chulda, which is smaller. Okay, that's basically that. Let's maybe see another question here, possibly. Question 13, no. TA 20 we already did. Okay, we didn't do TA21, I don't think. Nope. TB24. Adkan.